Hey guys, it's Dean. Welcome back to the Better Man podcast. Today's episode, I have two very special guests. Actually, we've never had two guests before, so this is really exciting for me. Um, but we've got two people from the Gallup institution, Gallup nonprofit. I don't know what to call it. But we're going to be talking about the facts. We're going to be getting into some statistics on topics that we cover very often in the Better Man podcast, things like work-life balance. We're going to talk about men at home, family life, happiness, and we're actually going to look at some of the data on this. We're also going to talk about loneliness and depression within this context. And then we're going to get really brave and talk about gender differences and considerations based on actual data. So I'm really excited for this conversation. I think you guys will be too. So, Mike and Ben, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having us, Dean.
Yeah. So, Mike has been a member of Manful Yoga for a couple years now.
I'm a lifer. I'm a
He's a light.
lifer.
I'm
That's
gonna.
right.
He's gonna be doing workouts with me until he's 90, and I'm well into my 60s. Just
Oh,
recording.
nice.
I'll have all white hair at that point. I'll have all white hair in like 6 years, based on my dad's genetics. Um, so yeah, that's how we set this up. And then Ben, what is your role at Gallup?
Hey Dean, thanks for having me. I'm director of research and strategy at Gallup, so I have the very cool job of getting to study how people work and live. A few of my favorite job responsibilities: our team creates a lot of the workplace articles and reports that come from Gallup that talk about what's happening in the workplace and how workplaces can be improved. And I'm also heavily involved in our research and development as well as our advisory services. So appreciate you inviting us to talk today.
Yeah. So, let's just start with what is Gallup?
Dean, or Mike, what is
What is
Gallup?
Gallup? So it's a nearly 90-year-old company that studies human behavior, data analytics, basically everything that would be important to humankind. That's on our agenda, and has been for a really long time. So, as a result of that, studies that started maybe 80 years ago, you can see the longitudinal data all the way from 80 years all the way to the present in some cases. So you really can see, how people's opinions have changed, how people's behaviors have changed in the context of how we're living now versus how we lived then. And then hopefully leaders and people that are interested in this can make better decisions for the greater good based on the evidence.
Wow, that's amazing. So, what are some of the most well-known studies or most well-known research that's come out of Gallup that satisfies that very long longitudinal um, criteria?
I'm looking at my scientist over here.
It's like picking from your children, right? I have to start by saying that whenever I say Gallup, people say, "Yeah, you guys used to call me to interrupt my family dinner all the time and ask me about who was gonna win the election." So, yeah, that's usually where our conversations start. But I'm a workplace scientist, so I don't spend a lot of
You're not
time
cold
on
calling
the
people.
uh, Yeah, not anymore. Not anymore.
Well, it's worth
Graduate
mentioning
from
we
that.
don't do political polling, so that's something that is
That's
in the
right.
past, that we no longer do, and people still consider us as that, even because it's just such a big deal.
Hmm.
Yep, yep. Yeah, I think maybe what's most pertinent today is one of the things we're famous for is the World Happiness Report.
Mm.
We do that research in collaboration with Oxford University and the United Nations, and we have some really good data relevant to our conversation today about how people evaluate the quality of their life, their positive emotional experiences, their negative emotional experiences. We're able to study really the 99% of the globe in that study that includes over 160 countries. So we looked at how people's life evaluations and those emotions fared against things like age this year is one way we calibrated it. So we studied people's life evaluations and emotions for a long time, but this year we really wanted to understand the growth curve on that really throughout your life stages. So we found things like when you look at lifespan across the globe, people's happiness tends to decline as you age. And a lot of that has to do with physical health, mental health, depression. As you get older, dementia becomes a much bigger risk and is becoming an increasingly larger risk. We've studied things like that to help provide insights not just to the psyche of the world, but also how are environmental factors affecting them. Because in the United States, for example, that relationship looks very different. Rather than happiness declining throughout your life, it actually takes more of a U shape. So when you're younger, you're optimally happy. As you age, have family, kids, get some responsibilities, happiness tends to decline, and then it starts to increase again at a point. And we've also been able to study some interesting trends that starts to pull apart generation versus life stage a little bit. So in that same study, we found that life evaluations were getting worse for young people at a faster rate
Mm,
in the United States. So, for example, today, young people have about the same level of happiness as elderly folks, and that used to not be true. Young people used to be much happier. So that starts to help us understand that you might just look at the data and say, hey, young people are happy. But then when you start to understand that their happiness is decreasing at an increasing rate, you start to look at that and you look at things like how is social media affecting them, how are social norms affecting them, what's happening in the world. So, that's one example of something that we've studied for many, many years, but we're able to freshen and get on the edge of each year. And those trends allow you to understand really what's truly changing. Because, like I said, you could just look at that data and say, hey, younger people are happier than older people, that's not really what's happening because we can look at the trend.
mm, yeah. I mean, that brings up, obviously we would look at what role does technology play on that. And we can make, I'm assuming you can make a hypothesis based on, okay, why are kids less happy? Have you done that? Or
Yeah,
what have you found?
absolutely, absolutely. So we followed that breadcrumb, turned into some rabbit holes, of course. But some of the things that drive these changes would be things like loneliness, for
Mm,
example. So recently, we've seen increases in negative emotions. Now, what's interesting is you can have negative and positive emotions throughout the same day, right? They're not necessarily the same thing. So if I look at things like negative things like stress, worry, anger, sadness, loneliness, we've seen those globally increase recently. We have not seen as much change in the positive emotions. And when you start to dig into what emotions are changing, we worry about things like loneliness right now in our data for really everyone, but also young people. So when you start thinking about technology, social media, actually video games for young
mm,
boys, as that usage increase and people spend more time alone, we see more loneliness. Right now, I think about 15% of people feel a lot of loneliness on a daily basis. And while 15% may not seem like a huge number, those are associated with really bad things like depression and mental health issues. So when we see a metric like that changing, we know the outcomes are bad. And we have to dig deeper. And as like you said, we start to worry about the technology piece. But you also worry about the other end of it. We also look at things like social support.
mm.
We look at people's ability to make their own choices and their freedoms. We look at their income. All those things play into how people are experiencing life. So, while technology is an enabler and a challenge, it's really how we handle technology within our society. So that starts to pull you into parenting and community and things like that.
Got it.
Ben, when you're talking about these factors and these root causes that contribute to people being happy or unhappy, I'm interested in this idea right now in social determination theory and sort of this is just my kind of definition of it. It seems to me that this idea is it's this that contentment, to be content, you need a sense of purpose, You need to be able to be
Mm.
authentic, and you need to have a sense of belonging. Is there any connection between what Gallup's finding in the data, and does that connect up to this theory and application?
Yeah, it really does. The number one correlate in our composite happiness metric in that report I was talking about, it actually is someone's ability to have freedom over their decision making or autonomy,
Mm.
as we might say, right? That's not the only correlate, but it was one of the
Mm,
highest correlates, and that plays right into self determination theory. And you also hit on another important point there, Mike. It's also aiming it at something. So we know purpose is really important so they can aim it. And when we look at our broader well-being data outside of the study, there's 5 elements of well-being that Gallup studies: career well-being, physical well-being, social well-being, financial well-being, and community. The one that tends to be most strongly correlated with people's life evaluations, how good of life they think they have, is actually career.
Mm.
And that's because you spend so much of your time at work, or if you're in school, building toward a career and work. Yeah, there's a lot of purpose, especially for men, derived from that, because you want to aim your life at something and be able to evaluate your progress. So, yes, absolutely, social determination theory plays in there, and it's a combination of having that autonomy to take control of your life, but also have something that you can point it at that's meaningful to you. And that's when you can start setting goals, learning from other people, investing in yourself, right? But without that direction, it's hard to aim your energy,
yeah,
right?
yeah, Dean. The when he's talking about this idea of work and everybody needs a job is was a saying that Gallup was saying for quite a while. Everybody needs a good job. It's what they need most to turn themselves around. And I heard that first. And the reason I'm at Gallup today, and I've only been here for less than 2 years now, is because I was running an organization called Leadership Rhode Island that oversaw leadership in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors in the state and had been doing it since '81. And this report came out that Gallup put out that compares state by state and showed that Rhode Island had the most actively disengaged workforce in the entire country. So
Wow.
1 in 5 working Rhode Islanders were miserable in their jobs. And Gallup has further been able to define that. What does that really mean, even in dollars and cents? What does that mean for the economy? And turns out an actively disengaged person on average costs $3,400 out of every $10,000 earned is sort of wasted, you might say. So say you're a $50,000 annual wage earner, 17 grand is out the window for that business, that agency, however you want to look at that, because they're not happy. They're maybe not treating customers well, or they're causing management rifts with internally and so on. So when that came to my attention, I was like, wow, we oversee leadership in the state. We were the first in the recession and we were the last out as a state. So everybody was focused on unemployment numbers. But here I'm like, okay, we've got unemployment numbers that are high and the governor and the business community really cared about them. But here we have 1 in 5 that are working that are totally miserable and they're costing employers money and they're just plain unhappy. And what does that do to society? So I started researching that, and that's how I found Gallup and found the research and the data. And the company had been doing all this amazing work in Fortune 500 companies that was traceable, and has all this great metrics on what does it mean to turn an actively disengaged person. Can you do that? What does it mean to have a fully engaged workforce? And then um, how do those ripple effects hit society at large? So we decided after about a year of planning and talking to people at Gallup that we were going to go down that direction. And in 3 years, we went from the most actively disengaged state in the country to number 15
Oh,
in the
wow.
country. And on this engagement question that says I get to do what I do best every day at work, we were
Mm.
49th in the country and went to number one. So
Wow.
this thing, we look at it at, you can look at it at work where we spend on average, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but I think Americans spend on average somewhere over 81,000 hours at work in their lifetime. I mean, it's the only other place you spend more time sleeping. So think about how that affects you. If your work life isn't good, if you're not engaged, if you don't have a sense of like emotional connectivity or belonging to your workplace, then what are you taking home with you? And then
Mhm.
how is that connecting to your family life, your children, your community at large? Are you disconnected there too? So you've got further, amplifying loneliness. So I'm so interested in how do we create these solutions in the workplace where we've got a bit of a captive audience? I mean, people are going to work. So you've got an opportunity as a leader to make a positive influence with them at work that then will go home with them. That will change all of society. So about a couple of years ago, about two and a
Hey,
half
hey,
years
Mike, I
ago.
wanna
Yeah,
I wanna jump in for a sec.
yeah,
This question came up. So
yeah,
the 81,000 hours working. So this is I'm assuming this is for the United States.
yeah. That's
Okay.
an American statistic, right, Ben?
Do you know how that
Correct.
compares to, how does that compare to, how does that compare to the UK? How does that compare to how does that compare to France? Which, France, UK, US, pretty significant differences in work life balance. So I'm just curious, how does that number, those figures of how much do people work in the United States, how does that compare to other countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. On average in the U.S., it's around 42 hours on average with a great range, huge range depending on job. So, off the top of my head, if you look at people who work like 50 hours plus a week in the US, that's maybe 10 or 15% of the US population. So when you think about how that compares globally, knowing that the average is about 42 hours a week, you just simply would look at that based against other countries' averages, which I don't have in front of me. But let's take an extreme example like France. Let's say they, let's say they capped them at 30, for example, so you could do the delta between 40 hours a week and 30 hours a week, and that percentage difference would be about your most extreme difference. So even in the most extreme situation like France, that's a 10-hour difference a week, right? Like that it's not as much as you'd think, right? It matters, and those hours are important, and obviously you're also setting boundaries within that different schedule. But even in France, they're still spending the vast majority of their life at work too,
Mhm.
right?
And when we do the happiness report, Ben, how do they fare? How do those compare? Is there a correlation there?
They I'm trying to think how many factors are involved in that. I can tell you from a life evaluation standpoint, they still have that trend where their life evaluations and happiness decline with age. And they're having the same issue where they are still seeing like an increase in negative emotions across the country. So that's not the silver bullet, I guess you could say, is just working less is the main takeaway. It's quality of life, right? It's how we spend our time. It's our experiences. This is U.S. data, but if I look at our U.S. data here in front of me, only 15% of people strongly agree that they felt active and productive every day, right? So that
Wow.
bar's pretty low, right? The bar's pretty low. Um, and I don't have the global number in front of me, but I do have the global employee engagement number in front of me. And I can tell you that only about a third of US employees are fully engaged at work. And then globally, it's less than that. So globally, it's in the 20s, 23% are engaged at work, right? So you can see that disparity. So if I just kind of jump right at the heart of the question, like, does less time working make your life better and work better? No.
Hmm.
No, it actually factually does not. It's the quality of the experience. Let me play that out a little bit more too. So while those sound like doom and gloom statistics, they're not true for everybody. That's the average. So there's a lot of organizations that have employee engagement rates at twice that rate. So instead of 30% of their employees being engaged, 70% of them are engaged because people invest in their engagement, their well-being, their development. So when organizations, teams, managers, people work on how they experience work and life together, it gets a lot better, right? So when you work on it, you can have a great life. But if you leave it unmanaged, that's the trouble, right? Work-life balance is even an interesting term, right? So you might just sit back and say you're feeling tired, stressed, burned out, you might just say, hey, I need a vacation. I need a day off. And you probably do, right? Like, it's important to
Mhm.
manage your health and do that. But if you come back to the same exact scenario that got you there, you might actually come back more upset, right? Because now you're coming back and you've done nothing about the root causes of your dissatisfaction, the hits on your well-being. Next time you take a vacation, maybe you don't come back, right? Maybe you really rethink what you're doing. So I guess my point there is, yes, there's variance in norms of how people work globally, amount of time they work, but a universal human truth is we spend the majority of our day at work. And we have a long ways to improve, and you really can't separate your personal well-being and your work well-being. Like, it's not, I mean, I'm not saying don't create a clean separation and compartmentalize in your day, right? Like, we've actually, if I play that out, we studied that too. We look at what we call blenders versus splitters. There's people who prefer to blend their day throughout the day, work and life. There's people who prefer to split their day and compartmentalize it. That split is actually 50-50. So, right, 50-50, right? And then most importantly, what we find is that when people work in the rhythm of life they prefer, when the blender gets to be a blender and the splitter gets to be a splitter, they're more engaged at work. They have higher well-being, less turnover, better health outcomes. So it's actually that alignment between how you work best, and how you really work that matters more than just sheerly numbers of like hours worked, for example.
It
So are you
has,
saying that the blenders have a better experience, or it just depends on what you the ability to choose?
Yeah, there's no right or
Okay.
wrong. It's the ability to choose.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's the ability to choose.
it's not always intuitive. I mean, one of the reasons I started doing man flow yoga, Dean, besides seeing Joe Bernier in Rhode Island become like amazing, I'm like, what are you
Yeah.
doing? Um,
Yeah. He's
besides
doing
that,
weights too, for
yeah, I know.
listeners.
He's a
He's
show off.
awesome.
Yeah. But besides that is, I had taken this role here at Gallup, and I was traveling to DC because I oversee the federal government stuff. And so I'm coming from Rhode Island to DC, and I'm not used to that commuter life. I'm not used to being away Monday through Thursday. So I've been doing Manflow for a little over a year now, not the full 2 years, and I was exhausted. I was I run on fumes. I'm tired, and I'm feeling what is called classic burnout at a
Mm,
new role where I need energy because I'm doing something new. I'm building a new initiative. I need energy, and so I walk into my neighborhood bar in Providence after a week where I'm just feeling it. And my bartender, who I also consider maybe a therapist at times, Arthur, he's like, he could tell I was upset, and he's like, "What's going on?" And sort of explain
mm,
it to him. Stuff, and he goes, "You know what I do?" He's a real big guy. He goes, "You know what I do when I feel like you? I just do, like, I work out, I go to the gym, I run, I play a sport, I do something that I can control because you can't control everything, but I can control
mm.
like right here."
Yeah.
And I said, "Huh, that's interesting." So, I talked to Joe, "What are you doing?" And next thing you know, I'm connected over here with Manflow. But then, about maybe a month later, I'm learning about burnout at Gallup, and I'm seeing this data. So we have this assessment called Clifton Strengths where you can determine what your top strengths are and talents. And there's a lot of science behind this thing. We could talk about that later if you want.
Mhm.
But essentially, it comes to find out that with my combination of strengths, which are high influencing sort of strengths, there's data on what you should do when you're burnt out, and it's not necessarily intuitive. So, for example, the instinct for a guy like me during burnout is to spend more time with family and friends outside of work. And that can increase my burnout, we found, by 34%. But here's the thing that is the best thing I could do. And it wouldn't have come to me if it weren't for art. I mean, I've exercised in the past of my life, but I haven't been doing it for quite a long time. The number one thing, I can reduce my burnout by 48% if I do physical activity.
Mm.
So I started doing your program, and all of a sudden, I'm starting to like feel differently. You would think, and I would think honestly, because I remember even when I told Joe I was going to do it, he's like, "You don't have time for that. Like, you're already doing so much. How can you do that?" Turns out, it was like the best thing I could ever do was move my body and do something like that. And it focused my mind, focused my head, gave me more energy. So the interesting thing I think about Gallup and the great research that Gallup does is we have like these hunches. I know I do. I've got like gut instinct. And then all of a sudden, it's like, well, here's proof. Here's the real evidence. We know this works. And then what do you do about that? So I love the idea of finding those kinds of truth. And of course, I went back to art and I'm like, you don't even know it, but you're practically a scientist here. Besides the mixology.
Nice. That's really cool. So now I have a question. What does the data say about, is there data about exercise statistics? Like what percent of people exercise regularly? And for me, a question that I think of is like, what is the most common type of exercise? Like how many people are going to the gym and using the exercise machines? How many people are going to Pilates or yoga or bar studios? How many people are running? How many people are doing like boot camp classes? Do you have, we didn't talk about this ahead of time. So if you don't have this data in front of you, that's okay. But I'm just curious, what are is there data about exercise statistics?
Well, there's data. I wish I had that good a memory and was that crisp on it. I spend most of my time looking at our workplace data. There's probably questions about treadmills and ping pong tables at work somewhere in there. I could dig up. I think the most relevant one I just kind of mentioned a little bit ago is that only 15% of people strongly agree that they're active and productive every day.
Mm,
Period. I'm not just saying at work, like across the board, right? So like if you combine work and life, that's a pretty low number, right? Also, as I'm sitting here looking across our well-being data and our 5 elements of well-being, this struck me as interesting. Men tend to score a little bit higher on their financial well-being and their community well-being than women, but no better on physical, as you're talking about social or career. So what's interesting, I'm kind of connecting that to maybe exercise. They really worry about their finances and their community, and they really put a lot of time and effort into that too. So when I think about exercise, I think about both sides of it. Let me add one more stat in there for you. 44% of men experience a lot of stress every day. So you're also got to be thinking about like what's causing that stress and where does it go, right? So if we look at that, we're like, okay, we have some challenges here for men. They worry about money, they focus on money, they focus on building their community. They have a lot of stress, right? So I start to think about what that translates to. Part of that is that stress needs to go somewhere. So they kind of need to
mm,
exercise, right? In whatever way it is. To your point, there's many different ways. On the flip side, they have to have energy to exercise
yeah.
and they have to have a well enough balanced life to exercise. So it is that interesting combination of when your well-being is a priority of your employer, because this is the area I know. I know what workplaces do with this. When your well-being's an priority to your employer, and when they invest in those elements of well-being, including your physical well-being, not only are you encouraged and provided time to get those exercises in because they know it'll make you more productive at work, you have a better work day so that you have energy to go work out after or spend it with your family and things like that. So I do have data on that that really makes that linkage between physical health, mental health, and then how you experience work.
Where are these 56% of men who are not stressed? What are they?
Oh no, a
Where
lot.
are they?
It says a lot. I experienced a lot of stress yesterday. Here, this one's kind of fun to bump up against other people's data outside of Gallup. So we look at that and we're like, oh my gosh, half are extremely stressed, extremely, right? Like, but then when you study like biological data, and I'm sure you guys probably know this better than anybody if you wear any sort of wearable devices that track your body throughout the day. There's these diurnal cycles, right, where you have energy peaks at different points in the day. So a lot of the game, if you look at how you spend your day, is spending that energy efficiently and well so that it's building, as it's increasing, you're using it in the right ways that gives you energy, but you're also taking breaks to maintain your energy. And then after work and after your workout, you're looking at your recovery cycles, right? So sometimes it can be a mistake just to look at the average of what is happening across the day because there's these ebbs and flows. So the question is, how do you manage those ebbs and flows? How do I make sure I have a good level of energy when I'm working or working out because I invested the right rest in, the right nutrition, I'm using my energy appropriately, I'm not trying to go full send all day, right? That's not going to work. And then also, where's my recovery time? And these health psychologists will look at things like, at what point do you need to start to shut it down at the end of the day?
Mm.
Like if you go to bed at too high of a rate of, I'll call it trauma, what's that going to
Some
do to you the
sometimes
next
it
day?
does feel like
Right.
trauma when you're going to bed and you're still stressed.
I got a 5-year-old and an 8 month old that, yes, they're pretty good at inducing trauma in the
Yeah,
evenings
yeah.
for sure.
I've got some similar ages to that in my house. That
Well, when you talk about a U curve, Ben, right, where you're happier when you're young and it declines, and I think it's like around
Yep.
the age of like 52, it starts to go up or something. It, are children related there? I mean, is it really parenting that is it really sucking the life out of you? Like, is that related?
It is. It is. No, no, genuinely, I don't know how to say it any more plainly than yes. And if you'd like to hear a lot of anecdotes of how they do it, I have stories from today, yesterday, and we did ear tubes yesterday, and there was a tornado while we were getting ear tubes. We had a shelter in place.
Wow.
It had rained the night before, so I didn't get to sleep before I took it. If you want me to give you a lot of examples, yes, there's this compounding nature where you're always working and living. I don't think you're doing one or the other,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and I'm glad
So
I'm
yeah,
glad you say that, and I'm assuming there's data behind this. So we're not just
absolutely.
speaking
Yep.
from our own personal experiences, but I think this is something that is I think this is something that social media has done, has propagated, but it's the idea that parenting is beautiful, and here, look, we're at the beach, and everyone's smiling for this photo, and now we're at home and the kids are sitting in their chairs and eating the food that we made them, and Marissa, my wife, and I were like, no, this is not what parenting is. Parenting is like 10% of it's great and most of it is just really, really stressful. It's like, why wouldn't you want to live your life and fight, flight, or freeze while you're at home? Like, join us, it's great. And so we every time that we have conversations with people who are you know good example. We went to London last week, and I met up with a friend of mine, and she is getting married. Met up with her and her fiance, and she's getting married a couple months from now. And we said to her, and we were talking about parenting because they're talking about their lives. They're like, well, we live in London, and I was like, what do you guys do for fun? And they said, well, we like to go out to eat. We go out to eat. We go hang out with our friends. We have a dog that we take care of, and I'm like, wow, it's really hard. I can't even relate to you. Like I'm trying to share similar experiences and say, oh, I kind of get that, but parenting makes things so different that it's almost like you need different conversation topics. You're like, okay, you're over here and you have this life experience right now, and I'm over here, and there's so little overlap. And so we're also telling them as we're, having this conversation, we're like, parenting is not, this parenting is difficult. Parenting is hard. Having a baby is really hard. Um, and social media in particular, I think, creates this idea that it's all, you know, beautiful and it's really great. And honestly, for the most part, it's not. It's really hard. So, yeah.
But I was thinking though, maybe on the backside of life, on that upswing side, Ben, maybe having those kids and they're grown and there's someone there for you that's got your back and that kind of thing, maybe that's part of it is part of the positive happiness for those that have had kids versus those who haven't, I would think. I don't know if there's data to show that, but
Yeah. 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 I mean, you're starting to catch the backswing if you have that fulfillment, and you're also getting some of that autonomy back, right? You're able to reinvest in you a little bit. So it's the best of both worlds because you can be proud of, the family you've grown and developed and who they're becoming, and you can spend kind of more adult time with them and do more things. You probably have more money later in life. I've been told that by a lot of dads. They're like, geez, I can finally, before I was investing just purely my time into my kids, but now I can take a lot of satisfaction in sending them to do things and watching them grow too. So yeah, I mean that's absolutely related. What's interesting to me, if you want to know the numbers behind it, to commiserate a little bit, a third of working Americans have kids 18 years old or younger. That's a lot, right? And if I take it from the employer's standpoint, that's a lot of people that I need to be engaging in a different way and supporting in a different way. Let me ratchet that up a little bit. If you look at people between the ages of 34 and 44, 60% of American workers have
Wow.
kids 18 years or younger, right? And in that, those are the years that are harder on you as a human being. There's just more on your plate. You don't have time to recover. You're responsible for so much more, right? So like to me, I always try to get employers to really think about that. Like those are also your mid-career professionals who are l- carrying a heavy load in your business, right? They tend to be more senior and working their way into leadership. I think of the gender roles in this, right? Generally speaking, guys make a little more money. There's the traditional breadwinner mentality that we have, right? So they shoulder a lot of that weight, both helping their employer run a successful business and run a successful
Mm,
family at the same time. So it does create an interesting challenge for men 'cause they can lean into those strengths, but at the same time, that's a fast path to burnout too, right? When you're trying to shoulder everything kind of on both ends. Men also tend to work longer hours. We talked about hours earlier. They're more likely to be in that 50-hour a week plus category, right? They're less likely to take time for themselves and make sure they're getting in that mental work, that workout, that meditation, that they're eating well, and they're also, I think we all kind of know, they're less likely to ask for help
mhm,
Mm.
too, right? So it's interesting to put that together. I think as a male, you want to be strong for your family, right? But sometimes being strong for your family is also investing in yourself. And there's the flip side of that we all know that we maybe justifiably so, keep some of the stuff quiet to ourselves. From a gender role standpoint, I mean, women do shoulder so much more of the childcare load. We ask men and women who the primary childcare provider is. 60% of women say it's them, and only 20% of men say it's them. So, I mean, women factually are 4 times more likely to be the caregiver. And I think we see this with our own spouses. It affects their careers. Like there's just no doubt about it. When we study this, we know that about 40% of women are likely to say that their childcare responsibilities has reduced their work hours.
mhm,
It's cost them a promotion or made them decide to not try for a promotion. And about 40% have even thought about pausing or stopping their job to take care of family. Um, I don't want to, I'm not one to get into the what's right for your family beliefs, right? I'm probably one of the worst perpetrators at watching my wife make dinner, and she runs her own business, works really hard, but it's an interesting balance if you're a guy because you are shouldering a lot, so is your wife. You want to be strong for your family, but if you don't figure out how to do that as a team, like Dean was saying earlier, and what you value and how you work together, like it's impossible for one person to do alone, let alone two people to try to do it separately, right?
mhm. Well,
So I just think that's interesting how what you two were talking about ties to what people are experiencing in both work and life. And these challenges, they just factually conflict. They conflict, they butt up against each other, they create gender role
But there's been,
discussions that should be
yeah, I
had,
mean, there's
right?
been so much written about, well, now you can work remotely, and isn't this great? Because now women can basically take care of the kids and work at the same time.
Totally.
I remember during the pandemic when we were all remote for the lockdown, and the director of programs in my organization was conducting, uh, an online forum with a big audience of university presidents. It was like a panel kind of thing, and at the end, I said, "Wow, you did really great." And she goes, "You have no idea." In the middle of when I asked the real zinger of the question to the sort of highest status president of that university, and we're all like with bated breath waiting for the response, she's like, "My daughter ran in and said, 'Can you open this fruit cup for me?'" And so she's like in the background trying to not look like she's opening a fruit cup. I mean, this is sort of the situation we're putting people in, right?
yeah.
Oh no, totally. It's absolutely that, and then hybrid has its own variety, like you're saying. That fruit cup's more likely to happen to your wife than you, and then you think about, like, look at the basics, like transportation, right? Like to and from school, beginning of the day, end of the day, and if the kid forgets something, right? Like the woman's more likely to do that, and that is one of the challenges. But I think us as guys see that, and then we're also then, we want to be helpful, and you don't always know how to be helpful, and sometimes then you pour yourself even more into your work, or like less into yourself, right? So it's that
Mm.
balance of like, how do we do this equitably as a family in the ways that work best for us, and it really is about making sure we're invested in the whole family, ourselves included, because factually we're really busy. you
I
know
mean, my personal experience with this, and I'm sure you guys can probably relate to this, and you guys listening can probably relate as well. But there's so many conflicting ideas about how do I fit into my family unit, because I grew up with my dad going to work at 5 o'clock, and he came home at 7:30 every day. Like there was, I think he had one day per week where he stayed home, and he would stand at the kitchen island with his laptop, and he would be working while getting my brother and I ready for school. But aside from that, he was at work at 5 o'clock. He used to get in trouble for going to work too early. Like he said, like they don't like me going to work too early. So, but that's just, he's always done that. And so for me, um, when we first had our son in 2020, right, pandemic, um, it was very difficult for me to be restricted to working between like 9 and 4, because my wife was, you know, I don't know if you've had, uh, if you've had your spouse go through um, giving birth and then taking care of a small child by herself. If you've had a spouse who hasn't gone crazy during that process, you're a unicorn. Uh, it's an extremely difficult process, and if one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking about stress statistics, is how different parenting is now versus when we lived in more traditional communities where it wasn't just mom playing with baby and then going off to dad playing with baby. It was, hey, here's a 3-year-old, take care of this baby. And when you get sick of that, there's a 5-year-old who lives next door. There's a 5-year-old who lives in the hut next door, or like whatever it was, like. So I think of how that, and how we didn't evolve biologically to live in these structures that we do now. But anyways, to go back to what I was talking about with the with my wife postpartum, and my ideas about my experience growing up with my family, was I felt like I should be allowed to go to work for a longer time. And it was really difficult for me to be able to accept that, I didn't have as much time to work as I wanted to. And, you're comparing that ideal to, well, it's different now, and women also have a right to work and pursue their careers, versus, but the other consideration there is like, well, like what's the, how am I biologically wired? Because it looks like my wife is much better at taking care of small children than I am, and I don't always want to be taking care of small children. So there's a lot of conflicting ideas about, how do I fit into my family unit, and how much time should I get to myself in order to pursue my career, my professional goals. And so anyways, there's a lot that goes into that, is my point.
And even building onto that, I think how that just connects every day to our presenteeism with our family too. I think of your story about your dad and those long hours. Our data very clearly show that men are more likely to be a manager, much more likely to be a senior leader. Women hear that and they're like, "That is a gender equity problem right there." They first say like, "Well, that's not right," especially considering that women are more educated than men on average, right? So they're gonna look at that and be like, "What the heck?" But at the same time, us, put yourself in your own shoes and that long workday, like it those responsibilities, especially later in your career, look really different, right? Like you can't just turn them off. When you go home, you're responsible for a team, a budget, a company, right? So like you are responsible for that at work. Your ego's in it as it should be, and it doesn't just stop at the door. So a big problem too is even if we figure out a little bit of equity in childcare handoffs and work hours, I think a big problem in today's society is your mind's still on it, or where's my phone? Your phone,
Right.
right, is following you to bed,
Mhm.
and it's following you on vacation. And I'll just speak for myself. Like my own kids tell me to pay attention and focus when I'm out playing with them in the driveway because I'm checking an email or a text, right? So like when you look at men's jobs, gender roles, and things like that, I mean, those jobs can be really demanding outside of working hours. Even when your company's not making you be on, right, at that point, because your mind's there.
Yeah.
So I think that brings up some other interesting challenges, is also presenteeism for when we are together, right?
Mhm.
It's interesting too because we know, Dean, that the 70% variance as to whether someone's engaged at their work or not is directly related to their supervisor or manager. So now when you're
Mhm.
running the data on this age group, these men, they're managing, whether the employees are engaged and being productive and having a positive well-being at work and all that is also on those same shoulders in many cases, right? To make sure that they're having those meaningful conversations with their employee that helps them balance all their components of well-being in the workplace.
Mm. Yeah. So getting more into that topic of what does work look like now and how has the pandemic changed that? So we talked we've touched on this topic a lot, but how does working remotely, working hybrid, working in person, how has that affected our mental, our emotional well-being, our sense of community, sense of purpose? What considerations should we be aware of? What does the data say? Oop, you're
Something
muted for
happened
some
to your
reason.
sound, Ben.
I muted myself. I thought one of you two muted me, like you
Yeah, it was a power move. I'm like,
knocked
you're
it.
talking too much. I'm gonna
Yeah,
mute you.
well played. Um, the first thing I think you can't gloss over is just the all of the stress, concern, burnout that was churned up at the beginning of the pandemic. I mean, for a lot of reasons, whether it was health related, money related, job related, you name it. And then we've just seen a lot of change since. So we saw record drops in well being early on in the pandemic.
Mm,
Businesses have never been more disrupted. So we had this extreme disruption phase. And then as that smoke started to clear a little bit there, we saw the great resignation where people started changing jobs because there were a lot of job opportunities out there. Businesses were growing. There were salary increase opportunities out there. So we saw this kind of growth change period. And then over the last 2 years, I would say we've hit what I would call a stabilization period where people settled more into the new normal that looks very different. And to your question, Dean, about how does like fully remote work, hybrid, how those work arrangements affect today? Well, you first look at how much they've changed. Prior to the pandemic, only about 9% of U.S. employees had a job that was fully remote. Today, that's up just over 20, so that's doubled. Um, and if I look at remote capable jobs that can be done remotely, the that increased from maybe 30% of jobs being flexible in some way prior to the pandemic to 54% being hybrid, and not just hybrid, but a lot more of those days spent at home than before. So there's a lot of remote work flexibility out there. Big picture, 8 in 10 remote capable workers now have some degree of flexibility. Only 2 in 10 don't. So that's a real flip from what it was prior to the pandemic. So that creates both opportunity and challenge, is what I would say. It creates opportunity to work more efficiently, to balance your week more efficiently, to work in the way that works best for you. That tends to be good for people's well being. But there's also these countervailing forces. So if I look at one group like fully remote people, for example, their biggest challenge is going to be becoming detached.
mm,
So what we see in our data for people that are fully remote is their connection to their company, their mission and purpose has declined the most. of everyone we studied. They and then we've also seen an increase in loneliness among those folks. I'm not saying everyone's feeling lonely who works remotely, but you are factually spending less interpersonal time in person with your colleagues. And then, like Mike said earlier, you spend the majority of your day at work. So that is a challenge. Like, where are you getting that interpersonal connection? That creates an interesting challenge for fully remote folks. There's also some potential career limiters or derailers for some people if you're not with your boss or leaders or a mentor as much, if you're not with your team as
Mm,
much, if you're not part of the culture, you become more and more detached over time, or at least you can be. Don't hear me wrong on this. I'm not saying you can't do fully remote work well. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying it creates some headwinds. On the flip side, look at like hybrid, which is ideally supposed to be um, the right blend, right? You're supposed to find the right blend of being in person and remote flexibility. That kind of creates a situation for what would hypothetically be optimal productivity, but it has its own unique challenges. You have people that are on different schedules, and it creates this thing I like to call coordination chaos. If I don't necessarily know what my coworkers are doing all the time, right? When are they available? When are we supposed to come together? It creates some inefficiencies to say the
mhm.
least.
Yeah,
So if
I
I put
remember my
that together,
mom
there's
saying,
some
I remember my mom saying her secretary went remote, to work from home, and she called her once, and she's like, "Hey, I need your help with something," and she said, "Oh, I'm at the grocery store right now," and she was really upset about it. He's like, "You're work That's not what working remote means."
totally. Yes. Yeah, well, that creates some inequities then too, right? Like where you need something and someone's not available, or there's someone who is on site all the time and they don't have that flexibility. That can create some resentment and frustration too. So you kind of put that all together. There's always a trade-off, right? With autonomy, um, comes the ability to engage in your work, engage in your well-being, take some control, but it also creates some challenges around what I would call the four C's: connection, collaboration, creativity, and culture. Those things are just a little bit more difficult to do when we're apart, right? So, point there being like we have to be more intentional about those things when we're working either fully remote or hybrid. Like, how are we creating those connections with other people? How are we getting together to collaborate on the right cadence at the right times? When are we creating space to just be creative and bounce ideas back and
Mm,
forth? What are we doing to build a shared sense of culture? So in the end, it's really how you manage it, right? It's how you manage it for your organization, for yourself, your team. So the potential is there to live a better life and work more effectively, but left unmanaged and unled, it actually creates chaos and
mm,
detachment. So it's interesting. It's my classic example is if you think about the best coach you ever had, the best teacher, they always push you to do a little bit more than you normally would. They push you to be a little bit more structured.
yeah.
They push you to be part of the team and a community, right? So without that coach in your life, um, our human nature is we do the thing that's easiest for us, and that's just heads down what we want to do on our own schedule. So you need those leaders and those coaches to make this all work together. And that is the point of leadership and systems and structures and organizations is to get people to do their best work and work together more effectively. So it's not an either or type situation, but we've hit this beautiful thing where we have flexibility in our lives, but it can also lead to some new problems if left unmanaged.
Mm. Yeah, that makes me think a lot about my own, work structure, and we, you can see right now, this is my empty office where I this is my empty office. There is no water cooler. There is no, you know, our our videographer will come in if I ask him to be here, and there's some sense of community then. But otherwise, it's just me, talking with. This is social for me. Like your pixels on my screen. This is like my social interaction. We've got one guy in New Jersey. We've got a guy in California. We've got a guy in Chicago. So we're all, that's the core team. We're all over the place. So, for me, there is definitely the sense of purpose, right? Definitely the idea that I'm doing meaningful work, that I have autonomy over my life, but I am not in, I'm not around people enough to have a sense of community. So when I go out and I buy coffee, it's sometimes I'm like, how do I be a human? I'm like, what do I say? They say something, and I'm like, oh, I don't know how to act with you because I haven't. The only person I've talked with today is my wife and my children. So it makes me think a lot about the deficiencies that I have um, in actual proximity connection with people on the team, but also, we tend to operate in silos a lot. And how can we really have how can we create this life for the people who work with us, that satisfies those four C's, that helps them, be happy and helps me be happier. Brings up a lot of thoughts for me.
Well, in working in leadership for so many years, I was constantly faced with senior leaders that had given it all up to work, right? All they're doing is working. They're just working. They might have families, but they are working. And then at some point during the course of their year with me, because there were these cohorts, they'd come up and start talking to me about a different way. And it was interesting, they would usually say, especially like the private sector folks, they'd say, I'm thinking about moving into the nonprofit sector. And I'd go, well, why? And they go, because it has such great purpose and it's like a community and it's really interesting to be in nonprofits. And then I'd say, well, have you thought about the money, and how much money you need? And then they'd realize, well, I can't afford to work in the nonprofit sector at this point, usually. But what I think they were all looking for was a sense of community and being involved in something that wasn't just home and it wasn't work. So we say work life balance, which turns into home life and work life. But
Right.
where's community at? And it seems to me that community matters so much. And I don't know, Ben, if you have data or statistics around that, because I know it's a core component of overall well-being is community, but I feel like it just gets overlooked a ton. Younger people seem to they value it. I feel like I look at my daughter, she's 25. It seems like she values community, but I'm not sure, and she gets it, but I'm not sure she's actually engaging either, right? Volunteerism tends to be down across the country, things like that,
Right.
right?
Right. Yeah, I think you should look at the practicality of that too, of like where you'd find it, right? Like Dean just said, like, well, this is also my social time and social well-being and sense of community right now, right? Are shopping malls even a thing anymore? I'm not sure. I don't go to the grocery store. I order all my
I, my
groceries, right? I
my
mean, like,
parents went to a mall recently and they described it as tired. So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I have a friend from small town Nebraska originally. I have a friend who will always tell me anytime I'm having a bad day or I'm getting too fired up about something, he's like, do you ever just go like outside and talk to 5 or 10 people? Because that just used to be part of your day. Like to get through the day, you probably talk to 30 people. He's like, the world's a good place. The world's a good place. Like look outside, go to the store, go to the mall, go talk to 10 people. I bet you most of them are pretty happy, and the problems that you were making problems probably are not as big as you think. But there is that like forced reckoning you do when you interact with other people, right?
Mm.
I always thought that's interesting. This is on the management leadership front. What's kind of amazing right now too is we have all these elevated concepts and new things we're trying to balance, right? What's incredible is that the thing it's made most difficult in our lives, both at work and home, in a lot of ways, is actually clarity of expectations and priorities.
Mm.
Because there's been so much change happening, and in a new world, you have not fully adapted to how to deal with it like we did before, right? Like organizations are changing a lot. 56% of employees say they've experienced a lot of disruption in their organization, including that even the demands of their customers have changed. So it really is a lot of priority chaos, a lot of change fatigue out there. And I think that's true at home as well. So I think it's fascinating that we're dealing with all these unique challenges, and a lot of it comes down to like finding home base again, clarifying our expectations and our priorities. One of our coaches likes to always preached to me this model she likes. She likes to talk about, how do you focus me? How do you free me from an unnecessary stress? And how do you know me? It sounds so easy, but it really is. Whether we're talking about
Say that one more time.
management, yeah, sure, yep, you bet. Focus me, free me from unnecessary stress, and know me.
Hmm.
Those three things. When she's coaching people, she always works on those three because if we can get down to the priorities we're aligned on, I have clarity. We have an aligned effort. If I think about freeing me or freeing you, I'm looking for what support you need. I'm looking for what you can offload that you shouldn't be doing or someone else should. And then also, it's just as important to know me, who I am, how I work, what my strengths are. Now I'm pulling together what we're doing, how we're doing it, and there's also that personal connection. Those three things are always so interesting to me. I get frazzled by all the, you know, crazy things that are going on or the speed of the day. When you can slow down and focus on those three things, you can almost find a sense of grounding each time you work on that. And of course, you move to the next meeting and it's all disrupted again. But it's just interesting how all these things really largely do come down to expectations, investment, and what's my path? Like, where am I going to take this? How are we going to do this together?
When I was an interrogator in the Army, we learned that um, the most stress a person could ever have was uncertainty. Fear of uncertainty was that would shut people right down. They'd make bad judgment, do things they wouldn't normally do if they had this fear of uncertainty. And so I've spent, I was in a long time ago, I spent decades of my life looking at that in society at large and who is coping with this fear of uncertainty and how does that negatively affect them. And then, of course, as a manager, or we like to use the term coach with us too, Dean, because we look at as managers as coaches. It's sort of a different style of how you would manage a person. I start to think about how do I, like you're saying, remove those things? How can I make it in setting those right expectations so the person knows what's expected of them at work matters so much? And in this new environment, I mean, we've got people going straight out of college, working a job. They've never even seen people in person. They're doing all of it here. Imagine what that's like. And then how do
Yeah.
you manage that person or coach that person in that work environment when they've never even seen you in the same room together. They just see a flat screen every day. And the importance that it puts on those of us in more senior roles to focus in on how do we do those things you talked about, Ben, with these younger folks coming into the workplace? Because a lot of us that have been doing the job for a while, we feel like, well, I can do this remotely, no problem. I know my job. I know what I'm doing. I can handle this. Okay, fine. But what about this next generation that needs you, that needs some of that wisdom and some of that institutional knowledge? What are you doing for them? What are you doing for the overall mission that you're supporting?
I mean, this for me, this just brings up how important managers are in terms of their employees, their team members, just overall happiness with life. There's a guy who's come to multiple Be the Better You retreats and weekend workshops that I've done here in Austin. His name is Donald. And I might be getting this slightly wrong, but he was a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist. And after realizing that so many of his clients, his patients that he was working with were experiencing significant stress or, depression, anxiety symptoms as a result of their managers, he actually got into executive coaching. And now he has this, you know, I don't know, 100 acres of ranch in Colorado and collects collects some nice checks every month from his business and is extremely happy, um, and meditates a lot and does a lot of these retreats type things. Um, but it just illustrates how not just that we have that managers have a responsibility to to be good managers, to coach their people. And it also strikes me that this this new way of working for a lot of us, where we aren't in person enough, where we don't have enough interaction with people. Um, Not only are those employees not doing as much as they could for their company, but they're also not growing personally as much as they could because they don't have that coach who's there to help push them. Um, so
Yeah, Dean,
yeah.
Dean, we that's a big part of Gallup's business is executive coaching, coaching at all levels, coaching managers. And we have a engagement survey that we put out in the workplace called Q12, where we ask questions that give us a sense of what's going on in that workplace and where could managers, where could leaders apply more emphasis and focus to improve that workplace. And it really looks like a lot like Maslow's um, pyramid, that sort of hierarchy of needs. When you really look at it, at the base of it is all these basic needs, which is, one of them, which we're talking about, is I know what's expected of me at work. I mean, if you think about it, if you don't know what's expected of you at work, then nothing else really matters. That's sort of like the base of the job. Like if I don't know that, then you can recognize me for what I did right and all. It just doesn't. I need to have a sense of that, and then it goes into management support, and then it goes into teamwork, and then it goes into growth. And so when you look at that pyramid, and it's not a linear thing, you're doing all those things. Although if you don't get that base right, if you don't get that, I know it's expected of me at work, I have the materials and equipment to do my job. If you don't get that part right, then the other things, they're hard to achieve. But we go into companies, we measure that. We go into nonprofits, we measure that, and then that gives managers and leaders this view on what could we do and what steps can we take to make sure that people are engaging better, which translates into their better well-being in the process.
Well, we've touched on a lot of topics that we talked about doing, but one thing I really wanted to get into is, this being the Better Man podcast, I would love to discuss gender differences, and we talked about this before we had the call, but I think today it's difficult to have conversations about gender differences. Um, yeah, I mean it is, right? You've got fear of being, oh, this guy's a misogynist because he said this, or this guy is you know, whatever. Um, but it's gotten to the point where you can't say anything. You can't say that any differences exist because it's but there have to be differences. So I'd love it if we can talk about some of what does the data say, right?
That's great. Great question on data. The data shows that there are far fewer gender differences in how um, men and women experience work and well-being than you would think. In fact, if gender as a variable is the least differentiating or predicting among all the variables I study. That doesn't mean there's not differences. That just means there's more common ground. And a lot of the differences you see are interpersonal related to other things, your personality, your circumstance, right? I'm not saying there's not gender role differences. There obviously are. But my point is, it's important to have a conversation about these things in the same way that 50% of people are splitters and 50% are blenders, right? It's about figuring out what these important topics about your life and your work mean to you. Now, we do see some things in the data that I mentioned before where men tend to have stronger financial well being, community well being, work longer hours, for example. That aligns with gender roles, right? On the flip side, women do tend to be the caregiver 4 times over, exponentially so. Caregiving does tend to be a challenge or a derailer to their careers,
Mm.
right? But what that means is we have to have a conversation about it. I think, just personally, I think it's good to always ask people how they're feeling about it first so that you can be authentic in sharing your responses, but also calibrate it a little bit with some
Mm.
sensitivity, right? I think it's really important that you're open about what you need for your well-being, your development, what you believe in, where you want to go in life, and discuss that with your partner in your community. At the same time, I think it's always good to listen first to hear what they're saying because you might frame your message a little bit differently. And I think that's where you can avoid the misogynistic type comments, right? Of like you can explain what you mean
Mm,
by actually, in some cases, I like my gender role. I do like to mow the yard, right? My wife hates mowing the yard. I'm a terrible cook. She loves to cook. Like those are some easy
mhm.
ones, right? The childcare ones I think are more difficult for me anyway, but like that's just me and my wife finding center for us.
What about
I think
happiness
it
and well-being, Ben? And has there been a change in this new remote environment, based upon gender?
yeah, gender I'd say lean. People in remote capable jobs that can have some flexibility across the board want it. Men tend to gravitate a little more toward hybrid work, a combination of remote and an office, but a little bit, not a lot. Men are less likely to want to work fully remote by a little bit. They want to be in person a little more, and they're a little bit more likely to want fully on site work if that's for them. Um, so, they like a little bit more of the combination. Women are the opposite. They want a little bit more flexibility, and that's often going to translate to those childcare responsibilities. I don't mean it's just for moms, right? I'm not saying that. But they do tend to want a little bit more, but not like a lot more. Like, wow, women want this, men want that. It's same with you brought up generation young people, and you could mix this in with the gender roles too. Young people are struggling a little bit at work in terms of finding good mentors, understanding how things work around these places because they're coming into a highly disrupted environment. So they need a little more support in the same way. They like flexibility, but they're less likely to want the fully remote version because they need more time together. So you could cross that by gender too, right? So I think you have to think about really those things in combination. I don't. This isn't data in front of me, but then you start to worry about things for men like shouldering too much of the load, right? Shouldering too much of the load, doubling down on their careers because they can control that when maybe they need to balance things a little bit better.
I can control my
Maybe
career. I
loneliness.
can't control my home life.
Thank you for saying it. I can't go on record saying that and go home and be okay. But yeah, I mean that's it, right? I mean it's that like you know how to work,
Yeah.
right? You know how to work. Maybe you're later in your career and you're in a leadership management position, so the stakes are high, right? So it's like a magnet. You're gonna gravitate towards that.
Do
Women are gonna gravitate towards making it work for everybody, including us
yeah.
guys,
But
right?
you've also flexed that muscle more, right, Dean? Yeah, like, as you were saying, right? It was one of those early programs I was on. Like strength plus flexibility equals mobility, right? It was, I put that in a lot of contexts of my life, trying to figure
Yes.
out where does that fit in other parts of my life. But you flex that muscle more, so working becomes more natural. The kids are
Yeah.
pretty new.
Are you saying my negative 10-inch sit and reach carries over to the workplace? Is that what you guys are saying?
No, definitely not a thing. So I've got some questions that I ask people at the end of this, and I think this is going to be interesting because I'm going to ask you these questions, but I want you to, instead of replying with your personal opinion, I want you to reply with based on your knowledge of the data. What would you say? So these are rapid fire questions. Just keep it to like one or two sentences. All right. So first question here is, what do you think is one habit, belief, or mindset that is most important when it comes to overall happiness?
Self-reflection and feedback.
Hmm. Analyzing the data.
Uh-huh. It's data is only as truthful as where you get it from, right? So you got to look at problems from different perspectives and really think about what that means for you.
Mm,
As Mike mentioned, 70% of our decision making is emotional, even though we think it's rational. So you have to look at what you're doing from different perspectives.
mm,
And in the management standpoint, and coaching others, it's looking at that person as an individual and recognizing their uniqueness and not applying the same to all,
mm.
which is we take these shortcuts in life and we apply the same treatment policy. We keep applying the same to all. And the reality is each person is very unique and very much an individual. And what works for one doesn't necessarily work for another.
Hmm. What's your answer, Mike?
I'm caught up on this. Ben may not say it. I'm not the data guy. I'm not the scientist in that. I'm the applying theory and applying data in real world and seeing how it works, and going in and working with people to do that. And I'm real hung up on this idea of contentment being this idea of purpose, authenticity, and belonging, and how critical those are. I really got turned on to this conceptually from Sebastian Junger's book Tribe when he was embedded with a unit in Afghanistan, and they came back from Afghanistan, and he met with them a year later and to see how they were doing, and they all wanted to be back in Afghanistan. He says, "What's wrong with our society if they'd rather be back in this really difficult, it's very remote place, fear of death like on a regular basis? What is it about that that's so much better than being back home in this first world country?" And that's sort of the concept of that whole book, and that's stuck in my head for a long time. I'm a vet myself, and what are those components? And he sort of dissects that in a really short book. What are those components that make them feel that way, that they'd rather be there than here? And I think it really comes down to this idea of purpose, authenticity, and belonging. But I don't have data for that. I'm just going by what
It's okay.
I've
We got
noticed.
one guy with the data. Got one guy with personal opinion. Normally it's opinion. It's not data. So this will be interesting. All right. Second question is: what is one thing that is often overlooked or undervalued by others when it comes to overall health and well-being? So, what is one aspect of our overall health and well-being that is often overlooked by most?
I'm going to cheat a little bit and say it's actually balance across the elements of well-being we study. So we study 5 elements of well-being that I mentioned, and it's actually finding balance across all 5. We find that when you just lean into one or two and neglect others, that affects your overall life evaluation and
Yep.
And
health.
those five
Ben, what
things.
are the 5?
You make me remember what I said before. Just kidding. So we study five elements of well-being: career well-being, physical well-being, social well-being, financial well-being, and community well-being. And the key is actually attending to each of those 5 and finding balance across them. When we overload on one or two things, usually our favorite thing, right? I'm a financial nerd, so I lean into our finances. Or I used to be a tennis player and a tennis
Can you
coach before
manage my
my
money
life. I
for
leaned
me?
into the physical.
I don't get it.
Well, I need more. Is I can manage money if I have more of it, is what I've learned.
I'll call you in 10 years.
And if I don't spend it, I manage it really well. Yeah.
All right. Mike, did you want to answer that?
Oh, I agree entirely with Ben on that one. I'm a believer. I'm a believer of those 5. And how do I do that in my own life, and how do I help others achieve that?
Okay. What is the most important activity that one can regularly do for overall stress management?
Well, I know that it varies by the individual for sure.
Perhaps a category of activities.
A category.
So
Stress
instead of saying
management.
yoga, it would be exercise or
Well, I can tell you, I gave that data earlier, right? And my instinct is to actually do more. And I've learned this by working on teams where they're like, "What the hell are you?" When I'm feeling like totally stressed out, I create new stuff. And people go, "Why are you doing that? Now there's more to do." And I think I figured it out. It's because I'm really good at starting things. And when I start things, it gives me a sense of control. I'm good at it. I get energized by it. And so I start more, but it's not the right thing to do. And the data, the Gallup data shows, and now I've applied this, I have to move. I have to do something kinetic. I have to do exercise. This yoga thing's been good for me for the last year or so. But I have to do that. And that proves out in the data for a person like me. But we've defined this in sort of 4 different categories, and different people should manage that stress and that burnout in different ways. Not what works for me will work for everyone. In fact, if someone is a high relationship building type of person, and is driven and has strengths around relationship building, doing the exercise isn't their number one thing to reduce stress. For example, we know that in the data. So it really does depend on the person.
What are the 4 categories?
So quite a long time ago, Dr. Donald Clifton, when he was trying to examine what's best in people, he determined that we all have these talents. And now Gallup has an assessment that you can take it online, and you get your talents in 1 through 34, and they're in rank order based on intensity. And those talents, for me, for example, just to give you a sense of like the vocabulary, my top 5 is communication, activator, um, futuristic, strategic, maximizer. Um, and when we look at ourselves through the lens of those talents, we look at ourselves and then we look at those around us. What the science shows is when we apply our strengths, if you will, our talents that become strengths with application, when we apply them toward our objectives, that's where we have the highest aptitude for excellence. That's where we get our energy. That's where we have a higher sense of well-being. Those workplace environments where the people use their strengths every day and managers are helping to coach them toward their strengths, they have a 3% higher quality of life, not just work, life. They're 8% more productive in the workplace. I might be wrong on that 8%. Ben, you'll correct me, I know. But so after they Dr. Clifton identified these 34, he started to see that they operate similarly. And so they're clustered into 4 categories of relationship building, influencing, strategic thinking, and executing. And so, and it also has come out that if for you and I to have the same top 5 in the same order, which is based on intensity, is 1 in 33 million. So now I'm a person and you're a person. We're not like a label, we're not a bucket. This is how we tend to naturally behave. And the science says if we're deliberate about how we would naturally behave and point them toward our objectives, that's where we can have the highest level of development. That's where we can achieve our goals. And so knowing that about each other can also help us look at how to manage through, like I was talking about, burnout. That's how I knew, right? That's how I knew in the data that the best thing for me to do is to move, is because I'm a natural influencer. Those are my strengths. That's how they're sort of clustered for the most part. I'm basically influencing in strategic thinking, almost in a lopsided way. Some people have a little bit of everything, kind of blended nicely and evenly. I do not. And so taking that assessment, becoming self-aware, and then also thinking about how you relate to others around you and what kind of bias you may have based on the strengths I have, that becomes this very enlightening experience. And to manage people or coach people or raise children, there's a parenting book about this. It's a whole new world of like, here's a blueprint with real evidence and real science behind it on, if we focused on this is how our lives can get better. That's what strengths-based development is, and that's largely what I used when I helped transform the state of Rhode Island for workforce engagement. But it's also what you can use at home with your relationships with your spouse and all of that.
So I want to come back to the question I asked. So there's 4. So for you, it was exercise. Are there 3 other main activities? And what are
Yeah,
those 3 things?
let me look them up so I don't tell you wrong.
Okay.
Yep, I can look them up right now. I got them. So for relationship building, folks, people that tend to have deeper relationships, intimate relationships, not necessarily like influencers, like lots of people, like everybody's my friend. These are people like my daughter who has really close friendships and gets really deep with people and has high empathy and so forth. The instinct when you're feeling burned out, we've learned for people with relationship building is to think about how, if they think about how their work affects others, because they're relationship builders, they tend to do that. That's like a compulsion. They'll decrease their burnout by 13%. But if they think about how they approached similar situations before, it decreases 43%. To me, these things aren't intuitive. It's something that I have to think about. So if I see one of,
Hey Mike,
yeah,
I'm gonna cut right here. So like
okay,
this section is much more
fast, yeah, yeah,
question, answer. And
yeah,
I think we've been on this one for 3 or 4 minutes. So
yep.
um
It's
is
a tough one to do in
yeah.
a soundbite. I can't really,
Yeah, it
yeah,
was good. It was just in this
gotcha.
context, I think people are already complaining about how long my episodes are. So like at this point people are just gonna be like, ah.
Is it-
So
Shut up
I was
already.
literally just gonna
so
say
yeah.
it's
So
it's actually just playing your strengths, right? Like the short answer is like the top correlate of reducing stress is spending more time in your day. When you do day reconstruction studies, spending more time in your day playing to your strengths,
yeah,
whatever
so
that
if you can
be.
say there's four categories. One of them is relationship building, one of them is influencing, one of them is strategic building, executing. For
Yep,
relationship building, this is what you should do. For
yep,
this is what you should do.
yep, yep.
So I'm going to ask the question again, and then we'll just and then we'll go over to Ben with his answer after that. Okay. All right. So one more. Okay, next question I have here is, what is the most important activity that one can regularly do for overall stress management?
Yeah, so you should play to your strengths is the number one answer. But there are four categories of folks and how those strengths cluster. So for people with high relationship building strengths, the number one thing they should do is think about how they approach that situation before, a similar situation before. That'll reduce burnout by 43%.
Wow.
For, yeah, for strategic thinking, domain folks, the number one thing you can do is think about your current situation as a challenge to find a way to succeed. That will reduce burnout by 42%. That's for strategic thinkers. For executing people, people that like to get things done, task list oriented people, the number one thing is stop and take time to think through the situation, not just get more done, think through the situation.
Mm,
It reduces it by 48%. That's huge. And then for folks like me, it's exercise. It's do something physical. That'll reduce my burnout by 48%, we've found.
wow. That's totally new information to me. That is awesome. That's really great to know. And there's a test that people can take to figure out which of these four categories they fit into. That's called the
Clifton Strengths. Yeah, Clifton Strengths is an assessment you do online, 35, 45 minutes timed, and it gives you your strengths in rank order from 1 to 34 based on intensity.
Okay. All right, I'll put this on my to-do list, but I'll stop and take time to think about it before I do it instead of just doing it. Ben, what's your answer?
Well, Mike took the silver bullet answer. From a research standpoint, the more time you spend during your day playing to your strengths, the better you tend to manage your stress. So I'll answer it a little bit different way. I'll look at burnout at work specifically. So about a quarter of men are highly burnt out at work, and about a third of women. What this tends to look like is fatigue, feelings of detachment, and reduced professional efficacy or effectiveness. And the top predictors of being burned out at work are, first of all, being treated unfairly at work. Second of all, having too heavy of workload. Third, ineffective manager communication. Fourth, lack of manager support. And then fifth, the speed or velocity at which work is happening. So, from that perspective, it's important that if you feel like you're not being treated fairly or respected at work, that you talk to somebody about it and address that. naturally you would think about your workload and managing your workload. What are the things that you should be prioritizing and you should be uniquely doing, versus where you might get partnership. And then from the manager standpoint, if your manager's not giving you the communication and support you need, you have to get comfortable with asking for that support and communication, or at least starting the conversation, to find a way forward. And then the speed of work's a challenge. Some jobs just happen at a very high velocity. Other times, we create that velocity and urgency through lack of planning and efficient use of time, or it's related to that work overload. But those are 5 factors I always try to keep in mind. If I can um, keep control of those 5 factors, I'm going to be in good shape.
Hmm. All right, those are really good to know. What is generally the most stressful part of people's day-to-day lives?
What's interesting is that ebbs and flows throughout the day, and it's likely to be interpersonal conflict. So it could be different for everybody, but what tends to be universal is a really negative experience with another person.
Mm,
The good news is that positive experiences can easily outweigh the negative experiences, and positive experiences um, will help you have a better day and better life. So they can make up for a lot, but those negative or interpersonal interactions, relationships can really wear on you.
hmm.
This idea, Dean, that the 70% variance to engagement is based on the manager or the supervisor sort of goes to that old cliche: you don't quit your job, you quit your boss. So sort of the contract, to
Mm.
me, the contrary is your boss can make all the difference. Your manager can make all the difference in the workplace for you. One way or the other, positive or negative.
Mm. I'm feeling a lot more pressure as a manager now than I did before I started this episode.
We're hireable.
Okay. All right. Good to know. That's helpful. All right. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing men and their well-being right now?
I think the biggest challenge for men is being proactive and taking the first step towards managing it. I think, based on our data, when men take action on their physical and mental health, they tend to get better at it. Our World Happiness Report shows that when you proactively manage your well-being earlier in life, it makes you less likely to have things like dementia, depression, substance abuse later. So I think it's about forming the habits, and getting started. My personal belief is that when you find community around that, you're more likely to stay committed and accountable to it.
Mm.
I think of that study from Harvard that's been going on with boys starting in the 1930s, and then they followed these boys as they've grown up, both boys with privilege and boys with little privilege. And one of the big conclusions in that study, some with privilege did poorly, some without privilege did amazing, and there was a lot of variation there. But the one thing that they did see where the person was healthier and lived longer was when they had someone in their life that had their back. Just one person, somebody that you knew had your back and you had theirs. That made all the difference. You'll live longer. There's been a reduced cases, according to Harvard, in Alzheimer's and dementia with those folks. So it's an interesting thing to think about. We need another person, just one, really, according to that study, just one. And we can bicker with that person, but we need to know at the end of the day you've got my back and I've got yours. It's so
Mm.
important.
All right. So, got a lot of really good information in that episode. And one thing that I really liked about it compared to some of the previous episodes that I've done is that we really focused on the data. And for most of it, we just pointed out here is what the data says. And we didn't spend as much time going into the problem solving aspect of it. So, I think that makes this episode unique, and it was cool for that reason. So, um, I want to thank you guys again, Mike, Ben. Thank you for coming on and doing this episode.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for what you do, Dean.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks for being part of it, Mike. And
I'm sucked in at this point.
you're alive. We've made you. You have no choice in the matter. And so, just to clarify, so Mike, what's your role with Gallup again?
So I'm the executive director that oversees the federal government initiative. So all this discussion around workforce and how we make a better workforce for everyone for their well-being and productivity, I oversee that for the federal government at Gallup.
Cool. And Ben?
And I'm director of research and strategy for our workplace practice. So I get to study how people work and live and how we can improve the lives of employees and organizations across the world.
And they're hireable, is what we're hireable. Great. Okay. Coming to a Manful Yoga office near you. Well, we don't have an office, so just going to be a lot of remote calls. But
we do a lot of virtual nowadays.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, I want to thank you again for coming on. That was a really great episode. For you guys listening, I hope you got a lot out of this. I hope you got some useful information, and you're ready to implement some of those that data into your life somehow. So I hope it inspires you to be a better man. I'll see you on the next episode. If you like that episode, check out this other one right here. I think you're really going to enjoy it. If you haven't subscribed, click this subscribe button over here, and you can listen to the full episodes on any major podcasting platform. Full details below in the description.